This article is The Obsolescence of the Hero's Journey by Gabriel Hart. So the hero's journey, and you can kind of see a little image of it there. It's just that idea of the guy being called to adventure, going through all the troubles of his character arc, and then back around to the transformation, atonement, and return home. Um, it's a very common story structure for a lot of genres, especially fantasy. Gabriel Hart is an accomplished author. We'll look at his bio real quick before we read his article. All the articles I share from LitReactor, I have permission from the editors and owners of LitReactor to do so. So I'm not sharing anybody's stuff without permission. Gabriel Hart lives in Morongo Valley in California's high desert. He's the author of Palm Springs noir novelette, A Return to Spring, the dyspocalyptic twin novel Virgins in Reverse / The Intrusion, and his debut poetry collection Unsongs Volume 1. Other works can be found at Expat Press, Shotgun Honey, Bristol Noir, Punk Noir. He's a monthly columnist for LitReactor and a regular contributor to Echno Clash Review. He's currently working on 2 novels, a short story collection, and Unsongs Volume 2. So that is his impressive bio. A lot of what he says here I kind of think have merit. I don't necessarily agree with everything, and I have some different views on a couple items. But again, Gabriel Hart writes many great articles, and I enjoy what he puts out there. I read it often. I'm not sure if this is the first one of his I've shared on stream, but he has an interesting viewpoint on things. And so we'll kind of work through this article, and I'll talk about what I agree, disagree with, and expand on some of it. But again, wouldn't be sharing if I didn't think it was a great article with merit. Last January, my late onset agoraphobia took a plunge. I can kind of feel him there. I've been inside a lot since the pandemic started. I joined a weekly Friday night online group for outsider and transgressive authors to share and critique one another's raw work, Gabriel says. Transgressive fiction is a type of subgenre of fiction that kind of fits pretty cleanly into crime fiction and a little bit into adjacent horror. The idea of transgressive fiction is that it involves characters that kind of reject the moral code and the expectations of society. It can also be about a character that has an arc where he starts off kind of feeling confined by the expectations and rules of society, and then finds a way to break those, sometimes illicitly and usually in unusual ways. So that's sort of the idea of transgressive fiction. It's some of my favorite stuff. It's kind of anti-heroes would fit very well into that, and so forth. So that's the type of fiction he's referring to. Having little idea what to expect, Gabriel says, I was initially on edge, only to be warmly welcomed by some of the most sincere and humbled people I'd met in some time. Once the challenging, often white-knuckling work began to be read, I knew I had found my crowd. While this group is serious about their work, they do not take themselves seriously. A cool drink of water in our culture war wasteland, where I felt I was finally able to unfurl, relax, and explore sharper angles of human nature, where style and approach could be discussed and critiqued without judging the actual content it takes to get there. Now, from this paragraph, I kind of get the idea that he kind of feels, maybe he identifies with transgressive fiction because he kind of feels confined by the rules of society, and maybe what he identifies as sort of PC culture and stuff like that. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I'm kind of getting that feel that sort of the rules of the writing industry don't really work as well for his type of fiction, I think he's saying. I know a number of extreme authors, extreme horror authors, and transgressive crime fiction authors who find plenty of homes in publishing and elsewhere for their work. So there are a lot of places, probably more now than in the recent past, for this type of work to kind of get a hearing, and a number of platforms, including like godless.com, that is just embracing the most extreme work, and a lot of readers are responding to that. Okay, one recent Friday night, Gabriel says, where the laughter and jovial camaraderie was at a particular high, someone reflected, why does this group work so well, considering most members are drug addicts, alcoholics, ex or present cons, misanthropes, cancellation refugees, dating site rejects, and the struggling mentally ill. Um, I don't want to pass judgment here, but that's a paragraph's maybe a little self-indulgent. I think every genre and subgenre have a lot of writers that kind of want to think of themselves as sort of the bad boys of writing, where they're misunderstood and pushed to the outside, and their stuff isn't appreciated and so forth. I know that Gabriel is a really great author. I think this particular line is maybe a little much, but again, I wasn't there, so let's just move on. It was a great question, considering we could be such an immediate magnet for drama and communal decay. But without blinking, my thesis was tempered. Number one, because you can't really define transgressive literature. You know it when you see it, so no one is trying to outdo one another in order to represent the nebulous form. All right, I kind of, again, no disrespect to the author here, I kind of push back a little bit to that idea of genres and subgenres that can't be defined. As we started the article, I think I gave a pretty solid definition for what transgressive fiction is. Things like bizarro fiction and weird fiction and so forth are a little bit harder to define on purpose, I think. But I think transgressive fiction can be pretty well understood and defined. I don't think that limits it at all, though. So I'm not claiming that transgressive fiction is formulaic or anything. I really don't think it is, and I do think it can push the boundaries of what you will find in other types of even crime fiction. But sort of this idea, this resistance to being defined, I think, is a little bit put on by some genres, and especially like I said, bizarro fiction, weird fiction, and I guess now transgressive fiction. And then many authors in particular just want to act like there's no definitions for what they do, and I don't think that's the case. I don't think it lessens the subgenre to define its form. But he says that he calls it maybe a nebulous form. So I write a little bit of crime, transgressive fiction, not as much as him. So I'll concede the point to the person with more experience that it may be a nebulous form. I don't think it's impossible to define, though. And number two, his thesis of why this group got along, because no one's work is following the antiquated narrative arc of the hero's journey. Now, again, I would say that that's probably likely true for that group. I don't know that that has anything to do with why they get along. It probably has more to do with their personalities. But the idea that they don't follow this arc, and so that's why they can talk about stories and get along, it's probably more along the lines of how he described them earlier, maybe lack of ego or that kind of thing. But again, this isn't the point of the article. He's leading into the point of the article. So we're talking about how the hero's journey as a story construct template is obsolete or outdated or not as valid as it once was. So let's get into that. Since there are no heroes, there are no villains in these works, no conveniently placed epiphanies, redemption, nor victorious homecoming. Therefore, no one is really arguing what is wrong or right, and no one involved feels they are owed anything. It's bolstering some daring work from writers, turning themselves inside out, places that often haunt me for days after, words that feel a lot like truth. Since then, I've re-evaluated some of the genre fiction I've written over the past 5 years. Crime, horror, sci-fi particularly. Now, I feel comfortable in those wheelhouses too. Horror tends to be where I center most, but I get into sci-fi and crime fiction as well. I don't write it as well as Gabriel or some of the other people he's going to mention in this article. Where I hated following the narrow-minded monomyth that's been cursing humanity since the days of the Bible. All right. Where while I'm confident in my writing, I have a theory some of my work might have been rejected in these genre venues because it doesn't scratch that hero myth itch with editors. That generally satisfying familiar path turned omnipresent curriculum by Joseph Campbell's The Power of Myth. Number 1, call to action. 2, conflict. 3, death, rebirth, revelation. 4, transformation, atonement. 5, return home. And again, that's a good summary of the hero's journey. Again, I kind of when an author starts trying to explain why their work just doesn't get picked up by some of these places. I do think, to an extent, that the more extreme work does have a harder time finding a home. I don't necessarily think that's always why an author is being rejected, because some of that work can still find a home in fairly traditional places. So, again, I'll concede the point to him in that I haven't lived his life and don't know for sure, but I don't know that it's fair to say that that's why things are being pushed out. I do think that there's only certain venues that'll take more experimental or work that kind of breaks the mold. A quote here: "The secret about home is that it actually doesn't exist. Home is just a foundational state of being. You'll spend your entire life trying and failing to return to it." That's John Lindsay from Body High. "Since our culture is inundated with the unrealistic outcomes of the hero's journey, one of its largest misinterpretations is that we tend to see our own lives as a story, as if we are still children who think we get a prize for being good, as if the bad guys get punished for not following our script. In fact, we see the hero's journey more rigidly followed in the Hollywood blockbuster film." I think that's probably true. "It's the chiseled male swashbuckler whose opposition conveniently fall to their knees, a girl to fall into their arms because he walked on the proverbial hot coals, or the empowering heroine who triumphantly dazzles the patriarchal world who previously doubted her. It brings us a quick, buttered popcorn dopamine hit that fools us into believing anything is possible, despite the fact it's merely the same story being told to us over and over again. These tales leave us empty once we return to real life. Their portrayed achievements, even as analogies, prove unattainable to reality because we aren't able to recognize them in our daily narratives unless we find ways to desperately shoehorn it in there." All right, so that's a kind of a bleak look. I think he does have some points there, though. I don't think there are any rules. Okay, again, I think we're getting a quote here. "I don't think there are any rules, but I like to respect the boundaries of storytelling. Put the characters before the plot. That I know to be 100% true," says screenwriter and recent Scripts for Change winner Anthony Todaro. "It's not about the journey, it's about the character's inner voice. That lie they perceive to be truth, which causes all the commotion and conflict. Otherwise, those who prescribe to set a system might be condemned to repeat mediocrity." All right, Gabriel continues here. "Last year, I blew through every episode. Let me make sure I'm on screen. Last year, I blew through every episode of Cobra Kai in a weekend, a rare instance of binge watching for me, as I usually avoid contemporary TV shows for their predictable and pandering plots. But what made the Karate Kid spin-off such compelling television was its complete subversion of the narrow hero's journey of its original source material. The roles of the hero and villain switched more times than you could count, the gray areas ever widening until you didn't know who to cheer for. The viewer was able to see themselves or someone they loved in some of the most repellent characters. But what made each character become the bad guy? The narrow-minded, self-righteous tunnel vision and unchecked anger, the fastest way to belittle the points of our plight. This I see as one of the more blatant trip-ups when we confuse the hero's journey with our real lives." All right, Gabriel continues. "Now, every time I return to genre crowds, most notably the indie crime fiction world, it tends to be inflamed with drama and infighting, instigated by those who shoot first and ask questions later, or not at all, under the guise they are defending the standard that exists only in their heads, possibly their ill-conceived hero's journey, so insular that they have made themselves judge, jury, and executioner, while the rest of us are simply trying to block out the noise and write." I think a lot of this seems to be in pushback towards the gatekeepers, like the folks that decide what books go through and which ones don't. I don't think crime fiction has nearly as much drama as the horror writing industry probably does. A lot of that's self-imposed by the people in it, the writers too, more than even just the publishers and gatekeepers. But as you get into crime fiction And then especially as you get into thriller authors, I really don't see nearly as much of that sort of drama that he's describing. But again, he's probably deeper into that world than I am. One of the biggest crime fiction novels of last year was S.A. Cosby's Blacktop Wasteland. That novel is awesome. S.A. Cosby is one of the most underappreciated authors out there right now, and he's appreciated a lot, so that's how good he is. My Darkest Prayer was the first book of his that I read. I actually was able to talk Cosby into giving me a reviewer copy of Blacktop Wasteland, and it was marvelous. One of not just the best novel of last year, one of the best novels I've ever read. He is a wildly talented author. I actually met him at a noir at the bar, where we do readings at a bar, and his story was the absolute best one there by a far cry. He's also a very humble guy, so you give him these compliments, and he just kind of takes them in blushing stride. But S.A. Cosby is just a wonderful person and just a excellent author. He may be, if he continues on the trajectory he's on, he should become one of the premier crime fiction writers of our time. So I think I've done a full sale on him there. The love of his southern rural noir was across the board unanimous. The way the fast cars felt propellant with the emotional drive of the story, and Cosby's very organic rise proved the book's vast accolades were authentic. I 100% agree with that. But for me, the best part of Blacktop Wasteland is rarely mentioned at all. Its perfect last line that's a grand statement of the imperfect as a means to an end. As he rode passenger in Bug's getaway car for 285 pages, his speedometer in the red as he left a trail of conflicted destruction behind him, his wife Kia asks, "You're never really going to change, are you, Bug?" The statement came out flat and listless, some might say hopeless. Finally he whispered, "I don't know if I can." That book was excellent, and not just in the ending part that he just described there, but and I've done a full review on this book, but Blacktop Wasteland, every time I thought I knew where the story was going, and we're talking from the very beginning, I would kind of get a feel like, okay, I understand what this story is, and he would immediately take a right turn or a left turn and just throw me off completely. And then we would get into the new thing. I'd be, oh, okay, that's what was going on back there. Now I understand what's going on here. And then another left turn. And it was never anything like out of left field where he's like, oh, well, these changes came from nowhere. There were always hints all the way through the novel that S.A. Cosby was showing you what the turn was going to be, but there was no way to see it until it happened. So he did that to me through the entire novel. Stephen King read this novel and was speaking very highly of it. So I'm very jealous of S.A. Cosby. He's a friend of mine, and I let him know on a regular basis how jealous I am of his success as I celebrate him. All right. Anyone who hoped this dangling sentiment leaves room for a sequel to see Bug maybe take change that can change is missing the point. It's a master stroke for Cosby, this line that immediately challenges the reader to take inventory of themselves, to see if they can identify with this man who's quite possibly beyond traditional family value redemption, and then that's the end of the line. It left me disintegrated, yet oddly comforted that I wasn't alone, and hopeful that others have the guts to go there. Again, just an excellent book. Anyone who picks it up, if you get nothing else out of this, go read Blacktop Wasteland. While I hold fast to my penchant for redemption be damned, I blindly asked a smattering of authors what they thought of today's relevance of the hero's journey. Okay, that's a good idea that he went through and asked other people what they thought, to see if I could get some counterpoint. Instead, their spontaneous thoughts on the matter largely bolstered my thesis of its increasing obsolescence. Again, may just be confirmation bias there, but if you ask people and enough people say it, then it starts to be a pattern. Here it's a quote. I'd say the hero's journey is justified. It's a reflection of the need for sacrifice and the need of growth, says Max Threnx, author of The Upcoming God is a Killer. But how heroic the character is depends where you choose to stop the narrative. For example, Oedipus the King is a hero's journey, but with a highly ironic end. Those are the ones I like the most. In noir and gangster stories, there is a journey of sorts, but at the end, failure is guaranteed. But the current ubiquity of hero's journey has a lot to do with the popularity of Star Wars and post-80s Disney. It's canned part of the manual now. All right, next quote. If we're going to talk about any shortcomings of the hero's journey, why not start with the form that subverts it, autofiction, says Josh Sherman, writer-editor of the online journal Charm Reduction. Through recording their own lives in fiction, these authors often learn something about themselves and in turn show readers how they might do the same. I don't think traditional fiction, with its narrative tensions and all its craft elements, can provide the same experience. But then there's the question of the reader's growth. Is that why you're reading? I'm not sure how much personal growth I get from listening to the same disco record 100 times, but you don't need a plot if your voice is a song. You got 2 bot alerts while I was gone. Yes, I blocked both of those, so we got them out of the way. All right, another quote here. Most minority narratives default to the hero's journey of the American dream, but that coin has 2 sides, says Argentinian writer Giselle Vasquez. Not everyone goes to college. They moonlight as a safe way to pay bills or find themselves in unstable relationships for housing, which, according to the hero's journey, mean they are flawed and need to change in order to get there, whatever that means. But these options are valid. Expecting anyone to change is going against their autonomy. This is especially true for minorities. We are plagued by stories where minorities are winning, correcting their flaws, which in the end feels performative or at the very least reductive. So that's a very interesting take there. A couple more quotes that he gives here to close off his article, kind of calling up whether the hero's journey works any longer. I've often felt like a hero's journey doesn't capture what a woman goes through, says Autumn Christian, author of Girl Like a Bomb. Okay, here's another one. If you don't get anything else out of this article, you should read Blacktop Wasteland by S.A. Cosby, and you should read Girl Like a Bomb by Autumn Christian. It is an amazing book that, again, is very subversive to narrative. It just... everything that you would expect, all the beats that you would want in a story, it goes a completely different direction, and it's a much better story. It was one of my most highly recommended books, I think last year or the year before. Girl Like a Bomb, like Autumn Christensen. All right, I'm going to give Gabriel Hart props here. He has picked some really solid authors to get feedback from, people who know what they're talking about. So as I'm reading through this article a second time, I'm going to lean closer to his thesis. And as I said, I kind of agreed with the overall point that the hero's journey doesn't really serve modern fiction as well as it might have used to, or as much as we leaned on it in the past, even though there may be some minor sub-points that he made that I kind of have a slightly different opinion on. So again, Girl Like a Bomb, great book you need to check out. So let's listen to what the rest of Autumn Christian has to say. Even on a metaphorical consciousness level, it feels incomplete to me. The closest to female hero's journey is probably what we find in romance novels, but still not quite. Regardless of gender, you will have to slay a dragon in order to achieve some kind of personality growth, but even the language is coded male. And again, the authors he's mentioning, the authors he's quoting, have written some of the best books I've ever read, so I'm going to have to defer to them. Last quote he has here: as a template for confronting the outside world, the hero's journey is not so realistic, says Alec Kshek, author of Lake County Incidents, editor of Pulp Modern. But as for the inner journey, the psychological journeys of life, I think it's not only valid but necessary for growth and maturity. And ultimately, even in a material sense, we do end up where we began, oblivion. But we are very changed by the time life circles back to that lonesome beginning end. All right. I very much like this article, even though maybe at the beginning, as I was going through, it sounded like I was pointing out more of what I disagreed with than what I agreed with. But the reason I shared this one was because I thought it had a lot of power to it. It addressed ideas in a way I had not seen elsewhere, and it kind of calls into question that panned accepted template for how stories have to go, how heroes have to end, how protagonists need to behave, how character arcs need to go. And his examples and the authors he pulled in were excellent and probably some of the strongest support for what he's saying here. So, despite the small places where I pushed back a little against some of the things he said or expressed a different opinion, overall, I have to say that he has made a strong point here that I generally agree with, and I'm more interested in stories that go different directions than ones that fall into that hero journeys pattern.